Um, I'm really pleased to be here. Of course, I've read MT's book, but in a funny coincidence, we actually go back further than that. MT and my husband at the Justice Department, starting what, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, something like that. And it's one of the things that makes MT's journey so interesting is that she started out as a lawyer at the Justice Department and then was sort of dragged into this field of elder justice at the Justice Department, then worked on key legislation, the Elder Justice Act, then from there got involved more broadly in the movement to look at aging and figure out how we could do better. So with that, this mic kind of goes in and out. Of course, I loved the book, especially loved the quotes and the poems at the beginnings of the chapters. I always appreciate that. And the first two parts are very sobering. Really outlines all the problems we have with housing, with healthcare. But then it ends on a more upbeat note, kind of where we go from here. And I'd like you to just talk about your personal evolution in those stages you went through and how it ended up with you writing this book.
Sure. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Mike, and all of you for being here, present and online. Can you hear me okay? Is that okay? So I didn't think I would end up here. I was a lawyer at the Department of Justice, as Morgan said, and I really didn't want to be a litigator anymore. Litigation looks backwards. It looks at what happened before and kind of wanted work that looked forward. And so I had an opportunity to get involved in these aging issues and brought what was then a civil fraud and civil prosecutor approach, thinking, okay, if we bring cases, that should really help. And we were looking at abuse and neglect by nursing homes. and that wasn't quite as effective as I hoped. And so I somehow, I looked at legislation that had taken on other kinds of issues, specifically the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act that was enacted in 1974 and the Violence Against Women Act that was enacted in 1994, and thought, oh, there's no law looking at trouble that happens in aging. Maybe I'll try and work on that. And, you know, which is sort of ridiculous hubris, really. But managed to make my way to the Senate. We worked on a law. You know, my co-drafter and I were, as she says, practically picking outfits for a signing ceremony that never happened. You know, we didn't think we really had any opponents because everybody was supposedly for it. And then the law languished and it languished and languished. And it was eventually enacted with the Affordable Care Act in 2010, but there was no funding until 2015, and then just, you know, very insignificant funding really, except for a brief blip in COVID relief funds. And so what I learned from that, or at least what I took from that, was that we have a bigger issue when it comes to aging as a society, and that it's an issue we don't really want to look at. And as I got further into it, it's this astonishing thing. Over the course of the 20th century, we gained on average 30 years of life. So in 1900, the average American lived 48 years. And by 2000, and still today, the average American lives 78 years. But the average healthy life expectancy is only 66 years. And so what are we doing? We haven't really prepared society to help us age well in a lot of different ways. And really, you all here are the few and the privileged and the enlightened in terms of forming community around aging. But that's not the norm. And our systems really are not prepared. And so that's really how I kind of lurched into writing a book because I have a friend, my walking partner is a political philosopher, and she said, you know, big problems need language. We need language to see them, to debate them, and ultimately to do something about them. And we really lack a language for aging. We don't really want to talk about it, but putting our heads in the sand collectively and individually generally doesn't turn out that well.
Yeah, I love that language. Yeah, and you do provide a lot of language for us in this book. This is a little bit of an aside, but was it hard for you to write about your own family's experience? There are a lot of very personal discussions about your mother-in-law and your mother and how the family dynamics work. Was that hard to do, and how did your family react?
Yes, it was really hard to do. And writing nonfiction is completely different than law and policy writing. Basically, law and policy just destroy your ability to write. And so it took me a while to recover and to learn how to really write nonfiction. So that was the first hurdle. And then editors said, you know, you have to put yourself in. And I'm like, this is not about me. This is about something else. And they're like, no, you have to put yourself in because my most beloved editor, a guy named Richard Todd, who is alas no longer with us, said, you know, your characters are contradancing. They're not in the same story. You need to be in the story for there to be a continuous spine. This is really a story of enlightenment, that you know, of learning. And so it's like, okay, I'll put myself in, but then also, you know, aging is always simultaneously a public event and a personal event. It's almost as intimate as almost as anything. And so, and it's a family event. And it became really clear to me that I was learning from my family members who were aging and from my own aging self. And that it would enrich the book because that the toggling between the personal and actually in the political and the cultural was, it provided additional perspectives. Now, like Morgan, she's from a very small family of only what, 6? I'm from a family of 8. And I didn't want to have finally finished the book only to have alienated my entire family. And, you know, my parents were, you know, very, very private people, and we don't write about our stuff. And so I was really scared, actually. And because everybody has big opinions about everything. And, but also writing about the family it is both very personal, but it's also a structural device for writing. And so I only put in what was absolutely necessary. And I got permission from both my father and my mother-in-law. And then maybe the only other thing to say is that a friend of mine who's an incredible writer herself said, you know, this is really not something that most people want to write about or read about. People need to understand why you're doing this work. And so that required some additional digging. And my mother, who died in 2008, was only alive for the very sort of the very beginnings of the idea of writing. But she really is the reason that I think that I went into the work I did. So, you know, so my poor mother was dragged into the book too.
Well, they were beautiful parts of it.
And I'm sorry, Morgan, could we ask you just to speak up a bit? People online have requested.
Oh, even louder.
Yes, please. Sorry.
All right. Apologies to everybody in the room if we're shouting. Yeah, the personal parts were lovely. We felt like we really got to know you and your family and a beautiful feeling of closeness there. So as we talked about at the beginning, you explore lots of the challenges that are associated with aging, housing, whether one stays at home or various kinds of aggregate housing, healthcare, and how the healthcare system is really not set up to deal with the issues of aging. You spend a fair amount of time talking about neglect and abuse of elders, whether it's, you know, online scams or family or AIDS or whatever. some very disturbing stories there. But underlying a lot of the problems is a broader issue of ageism throughout our culture. And if you could just talk a bit about that, explain, what ageism is and how you see it affecting all these other issues.
Sure. And Lynn, just tell me if I'm not speaking loud enough. Okay. I'm speaking in all caps. So ageism is actually this weird kind of bias because, and ageism is not exclusively bias against older people, but it's any kind of bias based on age. So young people, et cetera. And when it comes to bias relating to older people, older people have disproportionate wealth, disproportionate electoral power, and disproportionate governing power. And so it's not the usual kind of bias. And also we've had programs like Medicare and Social Security around for decades, whereas we haven't had child health insurance program for very long. And so I think it's really important to look at that piece, the economic and political piece. But that's the culture. And we know that like old and proud is not a thing, right? We can feel that in the culture, that people don't want to get old. I mean, the way I came to think about it is we want to get old, but not be old. And it's something called the longevity paradox, that as a society, we've moved heaven and earth to live longer lives, right? We have all these extraordinary procedures and cures and drugs and everything else. But we didn't spend very much time saying, okay, if I have the great privilege to live to 80 or 90 or 100, what is going to assure quality of life? And our reluctance to think about it or to do anything about it, to have a coherent long-term care system, which we do not have, to help caregivers, to have places that really feel inviting for collective living. Those values, or that fear of aging, that denial about aging, is infused into our systems, I think. And is really very damaging. Morgan and I were both part of a discussion last night about the role of art in caregiving, and because there are a number of theatrical performances in DC right now relating to that subject. And I guess my hope is that as we begin to talk about these issues more, that we can bend the arc. We've seen changes in how we, and how we handle bias, bias against women, racism, bias relating to gay rights. We've seen progress on those fronts. So it is possible, I think, but it starts with ourselves. And for me, that was one of the revelations, is that there's a guy named Andrew Solomon who has written a bunch of books, including one called Far from the Tree, where he talks about the gay rights movement in terms of first embracing yourself and finding meaning in who you are, and then building identity around that. And so if we loathe the idea of aging, it's going to be very hard to build identity around it, which is one of the really cool and admirable things about the villages, I think, which is that you all embrace that idea and that there's mutual support, which is actually not that common in our society, because, we revere youth and are pretty reluctant to think about old age. So I think there's a lot that we can do about ageism, but we need to be more intentional about it. And we also need to understand the ways that it's extraordinarily detrimental to our health and to our systems. There's a woman named Becca Levy who's sorry.
I think you might want to give up.
Yeah, or maybe I need to not be rolling around in my chair. But Becca Levy's an epidemiologist at Yale who's done a lot of work in ageism and found that people who have the most positive views of aging live on average 7.5 years longer than people who have the most negative views of aging. And that ageism costs, in the way that epidemiologists extrapolate these things, an average of $63 billion a year in unnecessary costs. That's a lot. And if you think about it, it's sort of consistent with a lot of other stuff that we know about negative views about ourselves and or about the culture. And so I think that's one of those things that we can all do something about.
Yeah, and as you were talking, it strikes me that I think women especially are subject to ageism because women are supposed to be beautiful and young and thin and admirable all the time. I think it's particularly an overlap between sexism and ageism, and women generally live longer. So in the older cohort, there are more women than men. So we probably need to make sure that there's overlap between those two issues as we deal with them. So back up a little bit, you mentioned in passing the Elder Justice Act that you helped draft and finally got passed in 2010. But in the book, you very clearly indicate that you were disappointed. So talk a little bit about what you thought it would achieve, what you thought the outcomes would be, and why you were disappointed. I know money is part of it, as always, but talk about that.
Yeah, there's a saying, by their budgets, ye shall know them. And so that's pretty clearly one reflection. I mean, one thing about the Elder Justice Act is that, if you do public stuff, it's really hard because all of your mistaken ideas or naive hopes are, they're there for everybody to see and for me to feel a little bit chagrined by, because that was how I was thinking about these issues in 2002. And I was still a prosecutor and I was still looking at problems through that lens. And thought that the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act and Violence Against Women Act were good models. I don't actually think that anymore. I think that they're endemic of a society that has come to think of law enforcement, prosecution, reports, investigations as solutions, as opposed to prevention. We don't think about prevention enough. We don't think about what can we do to prevent problems. We wait until problems happen by and large and then address them. And so the law did reflect that point of view that I had. There was, certainly, if large institutions are, nursing home chains are abusing, neglecting residents, or, you've got these terrible boiler rooms that defraud people. Of course, prosecution has an important role in certain contexts, but we're never going to prosecute our way out of trouble in aging. And what we need to think about is, what does prevention look like? And then put more effort there. So that's the sort of woe is me answer. Part of the answer. What I hoped was to create infrastructure to say, how do we improve aging? And there were really important parts of the law that didn't survive. For example, a community prevention study. I really think that we don't know very much about how to prevent trouble in aging. There are a few things. Good geriatric care has a tremendous impact. It's shown to extend health, extend well-being, extend independence. And of course, it's an area of medicine that we don't respect. Fewer than 50% of geriatrics fellowships were filled last year. And, it's among the lowest status neighborhoods in medicine. Even though, like primary care, it is shown to do tremendous it promotes health in really profound ways, and yet that's generally not how we roll as Americans. Because of what's rewarded, the way that we structure reimbursement systems do not reward a lot of parts of medicine and or services that we know work and that we know are really important. We also know that isolation is really bad for people, and that social support is social support is correlated with all sorts of good stuff. Connection, what you all are doing as part of the villages is incredibly important. It's not just like a social thing. It's incredibly important to well-being, health, psychic well-being, all the things. So what I would have done differently is focus much more effort on prevention, because I also think and believe that prevention, in the way that Washington does its math, it's preventive in terms of cost savings too. Because what happens when people run into trouble is that it increases the costs on Medicare, Medicaid, on other kinds of insurance programs. It increases the burden on caregivers, and caregiving has its own huge expense that is by and large never calculated or recognized. And so I think we need to put much more effort into that part of aging, and to figure out how are we going to support programs more effectively that promote well-being, not just longevity.
Do you think you could have gotten a law like that passed at the time?
No.
We couldn't even get the one that we had passed. And I mean, the thing is, and what's been really striking, a woman named Jill Lepore, who writes for, among other places, the New Yorker, wrote a really interesting piece called the Baby Doe, a political history of a tragedy, looking at the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act and what we did in child abuse. And essentially, it's a pretty good distillation of how we went awry, because in 1971, child advocates tried to enact a child welfare law, and it passed both houses of Congress. I think it was 90-10 in the Senate, and Richard Nixon vetoed it on the recommendation of Pat Buchanan, because it was, whatever it was, social welfare or something. And then what the lesson that politicians took from that, and Walter Mondale was the chief proponent of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, was to come back with only the most dire, horrible situations relating to child abuse, and only ones that affected really white upper middle class people. Not that it was a poverty issue, not that it was an issue of people of color, not that it was an issue of of lack of education or mental illness, but really it was just sort of a devastating lesson to say, oh no, we're not going to get out ahead of this problem. We're going to wait and respond. And that's really what we've done in the aging field too. And it's a lesson that, and it's a lesson we've seen in mental health too. We closed down the psych hospitals in the 70s and 80s, and the community mental health program that was supposed to follow and was supposed to pick up the slack never happened. There's a good book by a guy named Thomas Insel, I think it's called Healing, maybe, on the mental health crisis. We basically know what to do, and we don't do it again and again.
So we've talked about a lot of disappointing things, problems, challenges. And I think we all know that changes are needed. We in the village movement have our little angle on the changes, which is to bring people together and to help people stay in their communities. That's our little piece of it. So I have a couple of questions about change, and that are reflected in your book too. So number one, very specific question for this time in our country. Can we make this a bipartisan issue? Are there Republican champions that you know of? Can we frame this in a way that it doesn't become a political football?
Yes, I think we can, and I think we have to. Everybody gets old. Everybody loves people who are aging. We're all, it's all of us. And so, and historically, it doesn't involve some of the complicated issues that are involved in advocating on behalf of other populations. Historically, it has not, it has been pretty bipartisan, and my co-drafter and I worked very, very hard to make it bipartisan. We really worked hard to round up, senators like Rick Santorum, who some of you might remember, to say this too is a life issue. And we got the Family Research Council, which is a very conservative think tank and activist group, behind the law. And so I think it's possible. I think it's important. And I actually, so without being too political, I mean, progress is progress, and I think it's, I think it's possible. That said, who knows what's going to happen in the next few years?
There might not be an agency to deal with this anymore.
It doesn't involve vaccines, at least.
So here, related to that question, I have heard people say that, the ARP represents spoiled, I think I read this exact quote, spoiled aging baby boomers who are always asking for more. That's what ARP stood for, just asking for more for this particular cohort. So how do we broaden the discussion so it's not just getting more for those people? And we talked about this a bit before, you and I, even to broaden it to the extent to talk about, include the caregivers who are not in that generation or in that cohort. So it's not as much of an us versus them, we're just getting more.
I think this is among the most important questions, and also a place where my thinking has evolved. I think advocating for healthy aging is advocating for healthy people of all ages, and that there's way more that we can and should be doing on a bunch of different fronts. So there's a woman named Ijen who runs a organization called Domestic Workers Alliance and Caring Across Generations, and she's really quite a brilliant thinker and has been one of the leading voices in raising up the issues of caregivers and then broadening that voice, not just to include paid caregivers or domestic workers, but caregivers, family caregivers, informal caregivers, etc. And the well-being of all of us is entwined. We are all, as much as Americans, we like to think we're independent. We are actually all interdependent. And part of that is figuring out how to care for care workers. And it's something we've done a really bad job at. And I think that we're gonna be able to age well as a society unless we do a better job of caring for caregivers and raising up that work. Whether it is in the context of residential settings or paid caregivers at home or family caregivers. And in terms of family caregivers, I mean, the numbers are just astonishing because we essentially don't have a long-term care system, and because Medicare and long-term care insurance, Medicare and health insurance don't cover long-term care, and long-term care insurance is beyond the affordability of many people. A lot of people are scared of the long-term care system, the residential system that we have. Most people rely on informal caregivers, mostly family, mostly unpaid, and with very little support, often for an incredibly complicated and arduous job. And if we're going to be relying, and there are, according to AARP, actually about 50 million family and informal caregivers. It's a lot of people. That's more than the population of California. And unless we start supporting that workforce, where things are not going to turn out well. So that's one part of it. I also think that we need to think about aging starting in youth. The American Geriatric Society a few years was trying to figure out how to recruit more people into geriatrics and found that young people who had had more positive experiences with older people in their lives, whether they're family or friends or whoever, were much more inclined to go into geriatrics. Duh. I mean, it doesn't feel like rocket science. But what we have is a society that's increasingly segregated by age, right? Think about our predominant paradigms of aging. Either you're bunkered alone at home, which is supposed to be success, right? Successful aging is if you are basically stay in your own house alone as long as possible, or you live together with other older people in group settings. Those are really the prevailing paradigms, and we don't have healthy norms around living in a much more multi-age society or community. There's some, and actually AARP has supported what are called age-friendly communities. It's a World Health Organization initiative that started in 2006. And there's a certification you can get, et cetera, et cetera. But what we need to be moving in that direction much more, I think, in terms of intergenerationality, because older people and younger people have so much to offer one another, and there's a lot of need that actually can be fulfilled, and it's really good for everybody. So in terms of AARP, I've had my own journey with AARP and have certainly been disappointed often. But also they have a lot of power, and it's not unusual for advocacy organizations to go with the issues where there is the most political salience. And so they've kept their powder dry. It's mostly Medicare, Social Security, retirement pay of some sort, and very recently also caregiving. They have thrown their weight behind caregiving, and actually after the calamity in nursing homes and other long-term care during the pandemic, they have gotten more involved there. So, but they're extraordinarily powerful. So, we need powerful advocates, and we need to push powerful advocates.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm gonna do one more question. I want to get to questions from the audience. I know people are itching to ask questions, so I'll throw one more question at you, and then we'll turn to the audience. Do you know, and I asked you this yesterday, and maybe you've had time to come up with something. Do you know of places that do aging better? Whether it's other countries, specific communities, are there models that we can say, oh, we need to do it more like that?
So I always get this question, and I always fail at answering it. So I'll try failing better. Right? Is that the Beckett line? So when I started off writing the book, I thought, I'm going to do a comparative analysis. And every time I thought I had some great idea about some other country, I was at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars at the time, and somebody from that country would say, "You are dreaming. That is based on some kind of stereotype, and that's not how it is anymore." And et cetera, et cetera. So I was pretty humbled by that, and I was having enough trouble bringing the aging systems and culture and some potential solutions to ground in my own country, and finding that powerfully challenging. So I don't feel like I can speak with any degree of authority on that subject. A guy named, can I just say, it's not just me, a guy named Bruce Vladeck, who used to head the entity that now Dr. Oz is going to lead, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Advocacy, I called him a few months ago, basically asking him for advice about what to do next. And he said, I think you should get somebody to pay you to go to a bunch of countries that are as similar as possible to the United States and look at what their long-term care systems look like. The problem is a lot of those countries have universal health care. And have, different sorts of norms around that. So culturally, we are also different. And also those countries generally have a slightly greater degree of receptivity to communal living. So I don't know the answer.
In the US.
In the US, okay, so it's kind of idiosyncratic, and I did write about, some of the things that give me hope in the book. And some stuff that I think, we should go where it's warm. Not literally, but like we should look at examples that seem hopeful and seem quite replicable. I think one thing is intergenerationality, and actually I think it's a real opportunity for the villages to do more intergenerational stuff, because there are kids in need. There are people who can really benefit from the vast skill sets represented in this room and online. And it's good. I mean, there's a guy named Steve Cole at the University at UCLA who's done some really interesting work around, the lofty Greek terms are eudaimonia and hedonia, which generally translate into meaning making versus pleasure seeking. And that pleasure seeking is, in the short term, both things. Like if you do something pleasurable and you do something meaningful, there's a bump in, he studies our bodies at the metabolic level and inflammatory responses and all that sort of stuff. And, there's a good short-term benefit from both. But long-term, meaning making, the kinds of things where you either engage hard stuff, or you volunteer. He looked at people who were volunteering with kids at risk, older people who were volunteering with kids at risk, who are doing things that engage you at multiple levels. That has a benefit on the, sort of similar to exercise, stopping smoking, all the things, good diet, sleep. So that really, engaging in meaningful activity that has purpose and that makes you feel like you're engaged in something bigger than yourself is tremendously powerful and healthy. So there are programs that are co-located, right? Like an assisted living facility that has a childcare center next door or something, or a library that has, there are all kinds of co-location. But what we're doing is retrofitting a society that's been torn apart. And for right now, what I had to come to terms with is that we can work for a better world, but we can also only live in the world as it is now. And so we have to be hopeful and happy about making incremental change. And that is a lot of what you all are engaged in. But also, having big ideas. There's a guy named Mark Friedman who's in Berkeley, who runs an organization called Co-Generate and he's also focused on intergenerational activity, and he's looking for sort of activists, older people and younger people who have shared activism in some kind of bigger goal. And it's pretty cool. There are foster grandparent programs, which actually also there's one in town that a friend of mine's worked with. That's also can be an anti-poverty program, right? Where you pay people who have need to do something that is really important, and it doesn't, there are multiple benefits. There are great examples of communal living and of long-term care that, again, we have a lot of models of how to do things right. I think also well, this is in the prevention section, but being willing to think about what can go wrong and try and prevent against it. And also think about what we're missing in terms of the things that really matter. So, I think, yeah, there's a lot we can do. I'm pretty convinced of that. And then, there's all kinds of activism as well. Pick your flavor.
All right, that's great. Thank you. So let's go to questions.
Lynn, do you want to put us in the building? And I know Bethany is taking the ones that are online. We have 28 people online. So.
Okay, do you want me to pass the microphone or should people just
Good
stand
idea.
up?
Yes. I can do that.
Okay, we have a question.
Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you for giving me the privilege of talking to both of you. You've raised a really important topic. I think everybody in this room and anyone associated with the village understands that fundamentally. But we live in Washington, D.C. We're a political town. We understand power and we understand action. So, given this vast horizon of options and initiatives, what is your top pick for what people of our cohort can do in terms of specific action items to move the ball forward?
Wow.
Can we get back to us on that?
Yeah, well, I don't want to punt on an important question like that because you're exactly right. The debate I'm having in my head right now is that I think that grassroots peer-to-peer movements are really important, and that, you have a base, you have expertise, you have a cohort. I mean, you guys have done something miraculous, which is wrangled 13 nonprofits to swim in the same direction. I mean, that is, you don't need to be in Washington to know that that's a really hard thing to do. So, there's the conventional wisdom, which is that you go with issues that are moving. So I think caregiving is moving, mental health is moving, anti-isolation is moving. The Surgeon General has done a good amount on that. Presumably the next Surgeon General will have other priorities, but I think, there's energy and understanding in the body politic, I think, of those three things. But really kind of like the idea of thinking about the villages as a potential platform for doing some innovative stuff. Collectively in town, and then collectively, and then being a model. So I'm involved in something, after sort of bashing my head against the wall for many years and writing this book, I did learn a lot. And one of the things I learned was how we have approached basically interventions to elder abuse in a backwards way. And that so there are a few lessons, but one of them has to do with being reactive. The other one has to do with that when you override people's rights, generally there are worse outcomes, right? So that like benevolence is often not benevolence, and that inherent in aging are really complicated autonomy, safety issues and ethical dilemmas. Broke my leg pretty badly last year, and my daughter moved in with me for 3 months. And that was an incredible blessing. And sometimes she and I had different opinions about what I could and should do. And I'm guessing that that's happened with a lot of people in this room, and will accelerate as, we decide to make risky choices of various sorts. And then maybe you layer on a little bit of, cognitive issues, and then you make maybe, like giving away money, etc. Right? There are a lot of complicated issues. So in any event, we built a program that was reconceptualized, and we collected data, because I won't do anything without collecting data because there's so little evidence in the field. And the data came back roses. And so what's happening is that that program is now being replicated. We built a little nonprofit that we got our 501c3 status on Leap Day of this year. And then the Department of Health and Human Services put out a request for proposals, and we applied for it with this new nonprofit with a few bucks in the bank and got a $3.6 million grant over 3 years to replicate this program in 3 places in the United States. And the reason that happened is because we had data and we really worked hard at communicating about the data. We published it. I worked with researchers, with community leaders, with educators, and with Tracy, who's here in the room. And so we were very strategic. So I think that is within the 10 of the villages, because you guys have an extraordinary bench here, and a lot of firepower, and are in a really interesting place to do it. So I think what I would say is figure out a project that hits on several different big issues, work with researchers to collect data, and then be patient. You know, I think one of the other things we did was under announce and proclaim and overperform. So, you know, we tried to be kind of quiet. I mean, I realized what I just said wasn't all that unbraggy, but it's, you know, but it took us a long time to get here. It's taken us almost a decade to get to where we are. So I don't know. I think it's a hopeful platform.
And on that, just to follow up on that, as Mike said at the beginning, so we have pulled together all the 13 villages across DC to form this village collaborative. And one of our priorities is advocacy. So we have an advocacy working group. We've highlighted 3 issues that we want to focus on. Home health care. I mean, we're talking primarily advocacy at the DC government level. There's some bills that have been drafted about improving home health care, licensing, pay, those kinds of things. Issue number 2 is, now my mind's going blank, help me, Lynn. The 3 advocacy issues were home health aid, long-term care facilities and having better and more of them. And number
advocacy issues.
I think that was, anyway, I didn't prepare, I didn't look it up beforehand, but we have 3 very important issues. And just getting more funding in general for the kinds of things we do. And if anyone wants to help us with this advocacy agenda, everyone is welcome.
Thank you. And I just want to invite those of you online. Like I said, we have 28 people online. If you want to unmute and ask a question, I know Bethany is monitoring in the back. So please don't be bashful. We're glad you're here and we want you to participate as well. And there is a speaker, that's right. So, and if there's any other questions in that room while we're waiting for people to unmute. Well, I just want to say that also as villages, you know, kind of the intergenerational aspect is built in. Our volunteers are for the most part, you know, younger than our members. And there is that intergenerational aspect of building community. And I think, you know, I read this in your book. I know from what we do that the community aspect is so important to what we are bringing to the people who are in our villages. So I think we want to recognize that. And when you mentioned, you know, programs that support well-being, not just longevity. Well, you know, we have movie night tomorrow night. We have social hours. We're definitely on the same page. And it's really nice to hear it reinforced. So I thank you. And I appreciate the fact that what you're doing is really kind of pointing out who we are and what we do. And that's really valuable to us and to those of us here and online. So thank you again. Are there any other questions from online or in person? Tony, wait.
Hi, I worked for quite a long time in the question of affordable housing and developing co-ops. in southeast Washington. And it occurs to me, and it always occurs to me, that we are overhoused in this part of town and definitely underhoused in the rest of Washington. And right now there's a tremendous housing shortage everywhere in the United States, but it's certainly here as well. So there must be some way that we can combine this goal of being more intergenerational with helping to solve the housing crisis. And I can give the example, I take in interns. It's not painful, it's a lot of fun. I have a house full of older teenagers or young people, but something is ringing. Oh, maybe I'm ringing. Huh? You know what it is? We're all ringing. It's my phone telling me to stand up, that I've been 45 minutes and it's the right thing to do. I'm gonna talk and not stand up at this moment. But anyway, have you been thinking about that, combining the need for housing with perhaps plenty of housing and solving some of the intergenerational problems at the same time? Thanks. Thank you. I'll get you this.
I take in people too. And it is certainly, I mean, there is an increasing movement to do exactly that in all kinds of different contexts for people who are overhoused to share housing with people who are underhoused. And yeah, I mean, the affordable housing crisis is it's huge. And I think it as it relates to aging and long-term care, I mean, it's in our DNA to equate independence with success. But actually, we're communal people, and I'm hoping that there will be communities where I can live as part of them, both alone and together is a way that this guy, Christopher Alexander, wrote about it. And so I think it's partially a personal thing and partially a collective thing.
Getting the right people.
Right. And there are increasingly algorithms and apps and all kinds of stuff like that. And actually, I tried to write about the example. I mean, there's this proliferation of all kinds of different ways of doing this. Of, people taking people in either for free or for rent or, for some modest rent or barter for care, or grandparents who are raising grandkids living together in some sort of communal organization. A friend of mine just moved to something that it doesn't require as many meetings as co-housing, but still it's in Ithaca, and a group of people who bought around a beautiful community, smaller houses, some kind of collectivity. So I think there are a lot of models. It's a little overwhelming because there are so many different kinds of opportunities, and but you know more about this than I do. What can I say? But there are lots of ways to do this one at a time.
Thank you, Mike.
So very briefly,
I'll let those.
and with the notion that you conveyed that the AARP is beginning to get into some of the caregiver issues. And if there's a way, AARP with its 40,000 members, the largest membership group in the country, I believe. If there's a way of linking with the people in the AARP who are beginning to move in this direction, maybe some of DCVC's evolving activities capitalize on the DC location with AARP. And if there are some names of enlightened people at AARP that you might suggest that we could make some contact with and build on this huge political base so we're all less isolated.
Yeah, I think Morgan was just saying that you all work with AARP, DC, and often the local franchises are, have somewhat different kinds of priorities than the mothership. They, I do know, I mean, my favorite person at AARP runs a financial resilience. They have all these amazing titles. She's in thought leadership relating to financial resilience. And that actually is, I was thinking when, I think you were asking me what might be a good target. There are things in the financial world that I think are interesting potential areas for advocacy in terms of banks, uh, doing temporary holds with what look like suspicious transactions and making sure that customers have the opportunity to name a trusted contact like you would when you go to the hospital too, so that if there's some kind of wacky stuff going on with your account, they have somebody to call. And so that's, so she would be a good person, although she's not in the caregiving world. I think your contacts with the caregivers, the locals might be more effective. AARP generally does what it has very clear priorities that go through 400 bureaucratic levels. I mean, it's a little bit like a cross between a huge corporation and a huge government agency in terms of sort of the wheels turning. But it's very powerful, and Congress listens when they speak. So, but I was thinking there's another thing, that relating to the age-friendly communities, which is that in writing about age-friendly communities and in writing about villages, there's a lot of kind of whatever, there are a lot of relationships that are potentially there, I think, and some of the same priorities. And so they like their brands. So, it would have to, you would have to figure out that, but I think there's a confluence there. Yeah.
We work with age-friendly DC. The thing about age-friendly DC, unlike, I mean, they think of themselves as something like, LEED certification, where, you get the stamp age-friendly, whatever the city is. But it's pretty easy. DC is designated as an age-friendly city, and I think we all know that it has a lot to desire. So the standards for being age-friendly are still pretty basic. But we do, as the collaborative, we work with Age-Friendly DC. In fact, our executive director is on the advisory board for Age-Friendly DC. So we have some connections. We don't quite have the cloud of big AARP. Are there any other questions? Because if not, I have a final question that I think would be a good closeout to the whole session. And I warned MT about this. If you were queen of the universe and could wave your magic wand and make 3 things happen immediately, sure, it's done. MT says it and it is done. What 3 things would you do to move this issue forward?
Well, it's funny because I wrote down 5. But first, I just have to say one thank you to Mike, who, when I first met him at Tracy and John's house, basically told me, I did some oppo on you and you paid enough attention to the villages. I mean, he said it in a
mentioned it just, I hope I was.
yeah, no, you were much more polite than what I just said. But I mean, the message was taken, and and it was I think it was fair, and I took note. So, and I'm really grateful to you and Morgan and all of you. Okay, now I have to winnow them down to 3. So I'm gonna slice the baby. I'm gonna do 4, and 2 are sort of public things and two are more private. So one is to think about prevention and to think about like just to be knowledgeable. And when I was writing the book, basically the way I thought about it was that, you know, we're unprepared for aging's challenges often, and also unprepared to take advantage of what matters most and or distracted from that. And that knowledge can go a long way, knowledge and awareness. So, so in terms of prevention, I think there's just, you know, there are things out there to know about that are worth avoiding. You know, financial exploitation, there are protections you can put in place, not getting isolated, all that. That's number one. So really focusing on sort of prevention in terms of well-being and pushing for more knowledge about prevention. The second thing is care. And I do think that it rightfully gets a lot of attention right now. And I am thinking about it at a few different levels. So there's the kind of care we get, just, you know, getting good primary care, making sure you have somebody makes a huge difference. And if they happen to be knowledgeable about geriatrics, so much the better, because, you know, in the same way that we are, you know, we have distinct health needs when we're young, we have distinct health needs as we age. The second is long-term care. We need to fix our long-term care system. It is so broken. It is insane that that we don't have collective living places where we can get help and live together that we trust. We should have places that A, we trust, and B, that feel like home, and C, that are not this, you know, that don't induce horror in us. We can do that. And we haven't done it. And that is a lack of political will. And it goes back to the ageism question. And the third part, see, you know, it's the lawyer thing. Yeah. The third component of care is caregivers, is taking care of caregivers. We are expecting 50 million people who are working for basically no money to do a really hard job without support. So we need to support informal caregivers, and we need to pay and support and value paid caregivers properly. So addressing care, I think, is absolutely crucial. And it means lifting up care, the act of care, and the people who are providing it and the people for whom it is provided. Because what our current care system reflects is our lack of valuing older people and caregivers. So it's and then there are two things on the personal that actually also translate into the cultural. One of them is just to prepare, to have the hard conversations, to really think about this in our own lives and with the people we love and in our friend groups. And I'm sure you guys do a ton of it in the villages, in our communities, to have the conversations, have the hard conversations, think about, you know, what are the hard parts? What are the good parts? You know, there's a lot of cultural support when your kids are teenagers and when you're trying to navigate that. And there are a lot of complicated issues. And, you know, many of us have navigated that together. We don't have the same kind of collective and community support for navigating aging, and we should. And that is something that I think we can do in our own lives, and we can do in communities like the villages, and that you guys can be a really important example for how to do it without, not in a fear-based way, but in a, like, this is an opportunity to really think about the precious gift of time. Which takes me to the last thing, and which, as Morgan knows, was really for me the most important part of my research for the book, because I've pretty much been camped out in the, you know, bleaker neighborhood of aging for most of my career. And I underestimated the power of consciousness. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that in order to change society, we have to change our own minds and our own ways of thinking about aging. And we have to really think about it as a gift. I mean, we have this sacred gift of additional time on the planet. And how are we going to think about that? And we think about the health parts, right? But we don't think very well often about the meaning making aspects. And so it sounds kind of woo woo. And so I wanted to think about how can I distill it into action items, in the words of DC, or like, what are some concrete things that we can do? And so there are 5 things that I have, there are 5 things. First is connection, to stay connected to other people in our lives, and to work on the relationships that are important to us. When we're making our New Year's resolutions, we should be thinking about, like, what are we going to do to make sure that we take care of those relationships? And we know there's a Harvard study of human development that is the most important thing to well-being and in longevity. And it's also not just with the people we love, but also with our communities. So first is connection. The second thing is purpose. We live in a world that really was built for people who live 65 or 70 years. And then it's like, you're done, you get your plaque and your pen and your firm handshake and you're done with work. And you're like, oh no, there's a whole other chapter that we have. And so thinking about what we want to do is a kind of thinking that needs to happen way before we retire. And, we should be thinking about it, to think about, okay, this is an opportunity and how do we want to use it? And there have been some people who have been writing some interesting stuff about it. There's interesting organizations. We should be thinking about it in our own lives, and also how to nudge the culture to do a better job with that. And as I was mentioning earlier, the data there are also that it's tremendously healthy for us. The third thing is sort of a mashup of creativity and curiosity and play. We can lose our capacity for play and get really bogged down in our work lives often, and the creative parts of our existence sometimes fall away. And I have this chapter of my life to be one where I'm exploring new music, I'm exploring new art forms, I'm really trying to think about re-annexing creativity. My friend and colleague Ann Bastine has a watchword. She said, forget memory, try imagination. And it's a really lovely way of thinking about it, I think. The first thing is awe. Awe is that feeling we have when we look at the Grand Canyon, or we look at a starry sky, or that there's the overlook effect. People who have been up in space capsules looking at the Earth from the sky. And it's this weird paradox of when we feel really small and almost insignificant and part of the great flow of the universe, as the queen of the universe. Ironically, we have these super noisy egos, and it turns down that noise and it lets us sort of feel small and insignificant and part of the greater, state of being. Interestingly, there are people at Johns Hopkins who are doing studies now with psilocybin, and there's pretty good evidence that psychedelics can also help with that process, can help us sort of turn down the noise of the ego. So re-annexing awe, there's a wonderful book by a guy named Dr. Keltner on the subject too. So that's the fourth thing. And then the fifth thing is storytelling. We are what the anthropologists call homo narrans. All this random stuff happens to us in our lives, and we need to make sense of it somehow. And so we arrange those bits into the story of our lives and what we think of as our identities. But older people have a lot of stories, and we often forget to ask. There's a guy named Dave Isay who started a program called StoryCorps, and the day after Thanksgiving, he tries to remind people to ask the older people that we love for stories, but we also asking one another stories is a tremendously powerful thing, because the act of asking and the act of listening and the act of creating a story is this generative thing of creating a new human story. And it's also a powerful way of moving through the world, you know, any kind of productive advocacy is really based in storytelling. It arises from it. So I think, you know, telling the stories of the villages, I think, is another thing, going to your point of, you know, a way to move the power of what you all are doing into the world, because it's both simple and complicated and deserves to be heard. So in any event, I think shifting our focus from all the stuff that is hard, and, you know, sort of a series of problems, which is where we put too much focus with aging, and thinking about like, okay, it's a sacred gift of time, and how are we going to inhabit it in a way that has greatest meaning for us and together with the people we love, I think is, you know, sort of the most important thing of all.
Wow. I think we could have ended on a better note. I thank you, Morgan. I thank you. You know, as part of the village world, this is really, you know, so meaningful to us on many levels. I think you've definitely got a lot to think about and a lot to realize. So I thank you. I welcome you all to stay around. We've got food, we've got cookies, we've got, you know, wine. So please, the discussion doesn't have to end here. I want to remind members, volunteers from Georgetown Village that we do have a navigating aging group, and we will put on the calendar in January after the holidays. Let's get back together. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about where we're going and navigate our aging. So again, thank you very much.